We're going to begin with Norm on the topic managing dynamics locked fields using Power Automate and adaptive cards in Microsoft Teams. Norm, you want to take over the screen and take it away?
Thank you so much, David. It's great to be back. I also say that it's also hard to come in behind you with the amount of energy that you bring to these calls. It's appreciated. And I always learn something. And today what I learned is PSL, which I didn't even know was an acronym, Pumpkin Spice Life. So thanks for sharing that. So what are we talking about here today? We're talking about managing locked fields and dynamics, but this also extends out into Dataverse, and we're going to use Power Automate and adaptive cards in a possible solution or a different type of approach. It's nice to be here again. My name's Norm Young. I'm a Microsoft MVP out of Canada. I'm kind of between Toronto and Niagara Falls to give you a reference point. I'm a senior strategic consultant at Avepoint. When it comes to tech, I like Dataverse, I like model-driven apps. Also like Microsoft lists and SharePoint and most things to do with Power Automate and adaptive cards. Again, nice to be here. It's always great to come to these sessions, not just to hear the energy of David and all of the news updates from the different stakeholders and members, but to learn what other people are doing, to get validation of the types of things that you work on as well in my own work. So it's great to be here. So thanks for taking the time to be on the call and have listened to what we're doing, what we're talking about. And so today we're talking about locked fields in Dynamics and model-driven apps. And at my work, we have a very manual process where a number of fields inside of our Dynamics instance are locked, and a user cannot change them without a manual request to get them changed. And so it's very time-consuming, and the question was posed to myself and others, can we streamline the process without making significant changes inside of Dynamics? And the question was, yes, we could. One of the approaches that we could take is to use Power Automate and adaptive cards, where we could give the users a mechanism to request a change for multiple fields in a table, have an approval process, let them change the fields programmatically using Power Automate, and then notifications that can be passed around and enacted upon inside of Microsoft Teams. So to give a visual, these are what locked fields are in a Dynamics or a Dataverse experience. On the left image, you can see that I've highlighted number of employees, and there's a little lock icon. These are fields that the particular user cannot edit. They can only view them. On the right-hand side, you can see the technical implementation of that form in that field. You can see that it's been set to read-only. And so in our case, you need that manager approval to make that change to the record, because it's key to the business function, and changing those attributes can be contrary to some of the outcomes that we're doing. Technical implementation is just the form field in a model-driven app is set to read-only. So let's start at the end. Let's show what this experience looks like in a demo example. So we're going to start, and the persona that we're seeing on the screen is I'm the user, and I'm in my model-driven app, and I can see 3 locked fields: owner, stage, number of employees. I can't change them. So the solution will have me going up into Flow, initiating the workflow from the user perspective. And then this in turn will send our first adaptive card to the user. And then they can see the account that we're talking about, they can see the current value, and more importantly, they can make the request to change them. So I can change the account stage to prospect. I can change the number of employees to 6,000. I can assign a new owner, and I can put in some instructions for the person who will be approving or reviewing the request. There is a link in the adaptive card to come back to the record for convenience, and then finally the request change button, which will send off and start that approval process. I get a little confirmation when I've submitted an action on the card. So let's switch personas now, and let's become the manager or the person who's approving. And we're dynamically looking this up in the background. So I get the the title of the card that tells me what we're looking at. I get the information about what we're talking about. I can see the current value and the proposed values. And then I have comments to understand any type of instructions that the user might have. Again, I have that quick link that's being dynamically generated through the request using Power Automate expressions. I can view that record. I can enter in comments that I might want to provide back to the user. And then finally, I have the ability to approve or reject the request. And when I do something like approve, it's kicking off all those other types of actions that you'd expect to see inside of Power Automate. So again, there's my transaction receipt, if you will, that something has happened. And then I jump back as my user and I get the confirmation that it's been approved. Here are the new values that have been updated. And if I want to click back into the record, I can confirm that those values were changed. So in the previous working scenario, this would have been emails requesting approval, approving the approval or rejecting, and then asking someone with the right permissions to make the change. So now this is happening in one more streamlined, almost seamless experience where we're removing some of those manual steps out of the way. And so what did that flow look like behind the scenes that gave us like that end user experience? There's a lot of expressions, dynamic data, and of course the adaptive cards. But basically what we're doing is we're going to get the change details from the user and capture the rationale for the changes. We'll send all of those details over to the approval or the manager or the approval process. And again, if it's approved, let's update those fields on behalf of the users and send a message saying it's approved. If it's not approved, just say, sorry, this isn't going to work. So we spend a lot of time building up expressions and using dynamic data to create those links of convenience for the users. And then finally, we'll build out adaptive cards for user input, manager approvals, and finally the messaging. So the first card that we saw was to get the change details. This is the one that is sent to the user when they start that process. You know, first time we looked at this, we were like, oh, let's have a flow for each field that might change. And it's like, no way, that's just going to be too overwhelming for the user. So it's one flow, and then they can add the different fields that they may or may not want to change. And there's logic to check all of that. But the first thing, we need to provide context. We're talking about Microsoft Teams. Teams can be overwhelming with the amount of messages that you get. So it sounds so basic, but first point, what process are we asking our users to respond to? Give it a title, change locked fields. Number two, who are we talking about? So I'll put the account name, the table that it applies to, the account, and I'll give some context to that account, like the account number, the owner, the status, things that are important to my users for them to make sense of why they've been asked to look at this. I'll show them the current values, and then they can set their proposed values. So they make sure that they're actually making the changes that they expect. Comments, so important because there's always edge cases. Things are not always black and white in the real business world. So instructions to help the approver understand why. And then finally, the view record, which is that link of convenience to go back to the account if they need to double check something. And then finally, start the approval by requesting the change. Our second adaptive card that we saw in the demo was to send those change details to the approver. And so the approver is always dynamically looked up. So I go to one of the user tables, find out who the manager is, send that request over there. And again, the manager, just like the user, could be overwhelmed with messaging in Teams. So what are we looking at? We're looking at the change locked fields request. Who are we talking about? The customer, the information, showing them the before values and the after values. Give them, as an approver, opportunity to send instructions, feedback, and so on to the user with the view record link, that convenient link, and then finally the approve and the reject request. And both of those buttons will take separate actions. So inside of the flow, when the approver says, approve or eject, this is at a high level what happens. In the yes branch, we look at what changed in the account stage, and then we make those changes. Same thing with the employees changed and the owner changed. And there's different logic and conditions that apply. But finally, they get the message back saying, yes, it was approved and the values were changed. And opposite, it's denied and no changes were set. So adaptive cards. First time I looked at an adaptive card, I couldn't believe that I would have been expected to write JSON. I don't really know what JSON is, to be quite frank. I'm more of a maker. I don't have a background in development for me to know and understand these things. So the adaptivecards.io designer site, which is what we see on the screen right now, makes it so much easier to have a drag and drop experience where you can draw a card and allow you to set properties on those different elements. First time I got started, I used a sample and I just, tweak things to suit my needs. And then with a little bit of time and experience, I can now create them from a blank sample. But even as someone who's not a developer, I'm still able to create cards that are engaging for the users, they convey information, and they're actionable. And that's the important thing for the user experience. One of the things that I want to impress upon you is that the JSON may seem like a barrier if you had to read it, develop it, write it, so on, but the designer removes that barrier. And as you're designing out your cards, inevitably you're going to want to add dynamic data. Create a placeholder for that dynamic data. I use an @ symbol. You could use whatever you want, but don't let the progress of developing a card get hindered by your ability to know how or to put in the dynamic data. So let's take a look at how building an adaptive card can look. And so we're looking at this, the requester card, and that's what we have on the screen right now. So let's play the video. And this is, in full transparency, this is done at 2x speed. I'm not the fastest typist. I'm not the fastest person with a mouse, but we're in the designer. I've selected my host app to be Microsoft Teams. I've set the schema version, and now I'm just going to start drawing, if you will, dragging and dropping all of the different components to make a card that I think is engaging and conveys the right information. And that will eventually have the ability to take action. So you see, as I drag over something like a text field, I'm able to set properties. I can make the size, what I want, and it's all relative. It's not like pixel sizes. It's not like font sizes. It's make it extra large, change the color, make it an accent color or a warning color. Like it's stripped down functionality compared to what you're used to in like a SharePoint or a web designer or something like that. And that's what makes them adaptive to these different platforms, whether it's Teams, a bot, or email. You can write the code once and essentially move it around to other areas. And so here I'm doing something that I think is very important. I'm creating a placeholder. And in my example, I'm using an @ symbol and then the account name. And it's a placeholder because I know that when I copy the JSON code from the designer and I move it into Power Automate, I need to update those items inside of Power Automate. You could do anything you want. Just I needed some visual reference for myself. And so my tip is use an @ symbol. Create that placeholder. So there's a lot of formatting. I'm trying to make it look pretty. I've got an image. I created column sets. Now I'm adding a fact set, and a fact set is just like you think. It's just like a bulleted list of values. And so this is what's going to provide some of that context to my user. Again, I'll put in an account number as a label, and then the @ symbol account number for the dynamic data that I'm going to need to replace when I come into Power Automate. And the Power Automate piece, I think, is probably harder than developing the adaptive card piece. I feel pretty comfortable in Power Automate and spend a lot of my time in there, but when it comes to updating those values that are in the JSON code in Power Automate, it's not the most user-friendly experience. So these placeholders really help. And so here we are. We're laying out the card now. I've got the contextual information about the account number, the owner status, and so on. And so now I'm creating inputs. And now we have to do things like including an ID for the input. So I'm doing an account stage. I gave it a name. And now you'll see that I'm going to start populating choices. Current is 1. I'll go to the next one. And so in that drop-down menu box that we saw at the first demo, we have to manually put in each value that might be there. Those values, in turn, match what's inside of the account stage account record, and then you have to do that manually. Like there's no connecting an adaptive card to that Dataverse record that I'm aware of. So you can't dynamically look up these types of choice values. You have to program them in, and then you have to account for what the user selects in the adaptive cards to what's in Dataverse inside of your Power Automate routine, and we'll see that as well. So we've got that input. Now we're putting in the number of employees. I'm using colors to differentiate, like a current value versus an input value. I'll put in a text box. I will give instructions to the user. I'm trying to have a training list experience. I've done a number of these, but I still make mistakes and have to go back, and you probably may have seen one right there. I had to go back and update the drop-down menu box to give the right instructions. And now I'm making sure everything's right. Again, you do this all the time, and you're not immune to making user errors, and that's what's happening here. But we'll get past this. This is not a big deal. I'll provide a section for the owner. I'll format it the way I want. I'll put in that text box for input. One of the things that's kind of it's too bad about adaptive cards, but I'm not aware of any way where I can have email validation or a person lookup like we might have inside of Dataverse Dynamics or like a SharePoint list where it can resolve that name. There's no connection to that that technology that does that validation. So this is one of the drawbacks to the solution, is that if it's not an email address and it's not the right email address, I have no way of validating that at the point of user input inside of the adaptive card. And if someone knows a way to do that, please let me know in the chat, because I'm always looking to improve these things. So finally, we're putting in our last little section. This would be the user comments. And you see that I'm putting those IDs in. Doesn't seem that important right now, but it will when we go into preview mode. And so we've got all of that. Now we need some buttons. So I'll find the right section to highlight. We'll add an action. We'll have an open URL, and then we'll put in our link to the record, update that. And then the next one. And the next one's the most important one for any type of approval or action where you're going to take that feedback and use it inside of Power Automate, and that's a submit button. And when you do the submit button, what it's going to do is send data back to the calling application. So you'll see that I'm manually typing in some data now that'll get returned. So I'm doing something called the user action. I just made that up, and that it's updated. So it looks good. I think at this point, we'll put it into preview mode. I can see all of my values in the drop-down menu list. I can put in a number of employees. I can put in a new owner. I can add comments. And then if I click the view record button, it'll say what it would do. And then here's the important part. This is the data that gets sent back. And it's the data that gets sent back that's most important when we get inside of our flow. Okay, so that was kind of the easy part, even though it might be new for a lot of us. The hard part now is to take that JSON code, and it's significant, and put it into our Power Automate. So I'm going to copy the payload. I'm going to come into my flow, and I'm just going to add another adaptive card action. So in this case, I'm using Teams, post an adaptive card, and wait for a response. It's very much like an approval. And you have the ability to send it as the flow bot. So think of a one-on-one chat. You could put it in a channel. Think of a conversation. And so here's the part where I'm like, I could never write all this. Look at you. You didn't have to know what was in there in all that code. You just needed to know that the scroll bar was this big because there's this much stuff. And it's great if you can read and write that, but not all makers or citizen developers or business technologists can. So what I'm doing now is remember those placeholders where I said like use that @ symbol? And now I'm going through and I'm finding all of those instances where I need to change from a static value to a dynamic value. And this is the power of Power Automate, where I can get all of that data that I've retrieved and start using it inside of this adaptive card. But you'll notice you can almost get dizzy from scrolling up, scrolling down, scrolling up, scrolling down. There's not an easy way of doing this. I'll use things like expressions to move that through. So I'm just going to scroll ahead because, again, it can be a very dizzying exercise to see me scrolling up and down. The hard work is it's not in the adaptive card development. It is, knowing and getting the right data to plug into your card. And having those placeholders and that list of things that you're going to include for contextual data is so important. So I'm putting in my final URL to go back to the card, and then I'll have a final call out to my user who is going to receive the card, and we go from there. So I've just scrolled through that piece. No errors, but that's the hard part. It's like wiring it all up. Okay, getting close on time. Let's look at some of the key actions to understand what's required in doing all of this. Look at this list rows for account. Here's another thing that I would never know how to write. So I use tools like Fetch, XML Builder to help build out those queries. I can build a query in that tool and then copy in all those parameters to make it easy for me to do that. I use things like dynamically building that link over to Dynamics. I use that list rows model-driven apps, and I take that data and I can dynamically build out a link to that particular record. And it was hard to build the first time, but it saves my users so much work and time having to log into Dynamics, find the record, remember all the things that they need to. Now I can just press a button and go, excuse me. I need to zoom back because that was a very important piece and I wasn't talking fast enough. You'll see that on this compose action, I'm getting the feedback from the adaptive card. So when someone has requested requested the change, the feedback has to be captured and comes back. You don't get dynamic output from the adaptive card action in Teams. So you have to capture, compose it, do whatever. And now I'm going through and I'm requesting those changes. I'm almost done, David, so we're almost there. So now I'm going to capture that data, and you can see it again. It's the body data that comes from it. And it's all of that data that gets sent back from clicking that button that we saw in the, the adaptive cards designer. So now I'm evaluating the changes inside of the account stage. And you remember I said that each choice in the choice column had to be manually evaluated. This is what we're seeing here. So in the case where the value equals past, update the row, set it to past, things like that. Almost there. You can scroll through some of this. We'll evaluate if the employees change. We'll make the necessary change there. We'll evaluate if the owner changed. We'll make the changes there. And then finally, if everything has gone well, free of error and so on, we will send that final notification back to the user to say, hey, your changes have been approved and you're good to go. If it was rejected, we send them a message back. And then hopefully the approver has put in some meaningful comments for them to understand why it was rejected. And that's the flow. Not the most straightforward one for a new maker, but it's one that I think people with patience can build up to help their users simplify some of their processes. So my call to action to you is, I know most people on this call are very capable with technology, but the users that they support, that they represent, they may not know that these things are possible. So my call to action to you is to help your users find those manual and mundane tasks and try and automate them using things like Power Automate. Consider using adaptive cards for those situations where you can't have those user dialogues inside of an application. We have things like learning about adaptive cards on the Learn site. We have samples that are amazing to use. The designer, which we looked at briefly, really good. And it's never too late to learn more about Power Automate. And again, the samples. See what other people have done. Learn from others. More importantly, validate some of the work that you've done. Thank you all so much for taking time today to listen to my spiel about Power Automate, adaptive cards, and how they can be used to manage logged fields. If you want to keep the conversation going, let's hook up on my website or LinkedIn or Twitter, X, whatever we're calling it nowadays. And David, thank you so much, and back to you.
Thank you, Norm. Really great stuff there. I know there's a lot of information we packed into that, so really, really appreciate it.